Beginning. So my name is Lars Raudal. I work in the research group on tropical trees and landscapes associated with genetics and diversity at IGN, the Department of Geosciences and Natural Resource Management. We have for many years collaborated with CIFOR-ICRAF. ICRAF is the World Agroforestry and CIFOR is the Center for International Forest Research, so they have recently merged. And our collaboration has, in the last 10 years or so, focused on support to seed and seedling supply systems in support of forest landscape restoration and other kinds of tree planting. As part of that, we have worked on different kinds of decision support tools to support that kind of work. And that is what species to plant where, for instance, but also which kind of systems, agricultural systems, silvicultural systems, agroforestry systems to implement in the areas where restoration are ongoing. And with respect to the choice of species, it's of course a classical discipline in forestry, and the work that we are doing on decision support tools has actually been inspired by work that was initiated here in Denmark back in the 90s. There is, some of you will know, a website in Danish called plantevalg.dk, which translated means what to plant where in Denmark. This has been quite a successful tool in Denmark, and based on that we were inspired to say that we want to do something similar, but not just for Denmark, for the world, or at least for the global tropics. And I can't say that we are there now, but we have come part of the way with quite a lot of databases and decision support tools to assist tree planters in finding, say, the right species and the right planting material. And now we are fortunate to have Ilyas Siddique with us, who is an associate professor at the Federal University of now I forgot the Santa Catarina in Brazil. He's with us for a year, dividing his time between CIFOR-ICRAF in Nairobi and University of Copenhagen. And today he will introduce us to the work that he's doing, which should help us in getting one step further in terms of making decisions on what to plant where and how to do it. So welcome, Ilyas. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be able to share some of our work, our collaboration here with you. I will present today the first seminar here at Copenhagen, which will focus on decision support, as Lars already introduced. Now, what we're trying to do is combine both scientific knowledge based on plant ecophysiology and related disciplines with practitioners' knowledge, with knowledge of people who manage agroecosystems, farmers, foresters, and restorationists. So we're really wanting to achieve a multifunctional landscape restoration for sustainable use and for restoration of the ecosystem functions and services. So the challenge is to produce a diversity of foods, medicines, fodder, timber, fuel, green manures, and to minimize inputs, especially external inputs. And at the same time, in the same space, restore soil health, biodiversity native to the ecoregion, especially threatened species, and incorporate threatened species into production and use, economic use and conservation through sustainable use. And without spending a long time researching, planning, just to shortcut all the preparation that's needed to pull this off, this challenge of integrating conservation and sustainable use. So I'll briefly illustrate some of the tools that Lars mentioned that CIFOR-ICRAF has already made available. So they are freely available online on that address that is shown at the top. And there is a detailed paper published in scientific reports, cited here, that goes into much more detail about how actually these tools work, how they were set up. But as a brief introduction, the challenge to know what to plant where is really to fit species to the right places, or the other way around. Identify a place where we want to perform our restoration work or agricultural work or silvicultural work, and select the right species that are really ideally adapted to those conditions. So first of all, the tool allows us to select a country, our country, and then from a continental level to specifically to country. And in larger countries, you can select also a region within the country. Now, this particular tool is called the Global Useful Native Trees tool, or GlobUNT. So once we've selected our country, we can select a weather station that's closest to us or that has a most similar climate to our restoration or agricultural site. So I pick a different example now just to show the global reach of it. So in this case, it's actually Santa Catarina in Brazil, and a particular weather station in the highlands in the middle of Santa Catarina. And then it gives us a direct link to the Meteostat site of that particular weather station, where we can pull out detailed climatological data for that weather station. But for those people who are not familiar with climate data or the details of how to measure climate, what variables matter, they can skip that. So it's really designed to be useful for a broad audience. And then we can add another functionality here. We can select which climate scenario we're interested in. Is it the baseline climate of now? Or do we want to select one of 3 scenarios of future climates? This is particularly important for planting species that are very slow growing, which are in many cases the most threatened species that are slow growing tropical forest trees, for example, that represent a large portion of the threatened species of the world. So we really need to figure out or to make sure that these slow-growing species can still thrive in decades' time. So we can pick a future climate scenario in this last function here. And then automatically the tool will generate a set of bioclimatic variables, the 10 key bioclimatic variables that are important for the distribution of plant species and the potential for those species to thrive under those climatic conditions. So users can also manually change those, but for the most widespread users, it's probably convenient to just take the automatic selection of bioclimatic variables and properties that are already given by the tool based on the weather station and the climate scenario that we've selected. But by default, if we don't want to get into future climates, we can, by default, the tool just uses this current climate, the baseline. And so then let's take again the example of East Africa, where related tool allows us to map globally the climatic conditions and species that are adapted to those climatic conditions, which is called tree goer or globally observed environmental ranges, which is a global atlas and tree species distributions. And it actually covers a very large portion of all known tree species, and nearly 50,000 tree species of the 60 to 70,000 known species of trees. So this tool finally allows us to really capture a large portion of the variation in tree biodiversity in the world. And so by selecting positions in the on the globe or in our country, we can then see which species are well adapted to this climate, either current or future. Now, as a second step, we can then select what do we need? What does our local community need in terms of timber, fuel, forage, human food, medicines, or other uses? So these are basically levels of filtering so that we can reduce the list of 50,000 or 14,000 species, which are known and mapped around the world, to only those, a couple of hundred or so, that are well adapted to our local climate. And then, as a second level, we can reduce these even further, the big list of hundreds of species, we can reduce these even further to those species that actually address our socioeconomic demands of our local community where we're engaging in a project, or the actual farmer or extensionist who wants to use the tool to decide how to restore the landscape, the agroecosystem with tree biodiversity in it. Now, when I say hundreds of species for a particular site, I'm taking the example of the tropics. Here, of course, it will be a shorter list, but the same principle applies. Like even for Denmark or for other temperate climates, the tool also works very nicely to select the right species that are adapted to the climate. And so these are the broad categories of uses. That's the second level. And then we can directly skip to the list of species that are actually adapted and address those socioeconomic demands. So it's a very quick selection process that shortcuts huge amount of research that users usually have to engage in to find the species well adapted to their site. And it also helps to find less well-documented species that are usually not in the standard manuals for restoration or for silviculture, but rather threatened species. And it even highlights here, for example, in red, background red, highlights the threatened species that are, according to the IUCN conservation status criteria. So that helps us to actively incorporate and prioritize threatened species in conservation through sustainable use within the agroecosystem. And then within that table of all the species that are well adapted to our local climate and address our socioeconomic demands, we can then find much more information through the agroforestry species switchboard. Another tool also made available by CIFOR-ICRAF, which gives links to several other external databases that carry detailed technical, silvicultural, ecophysiological information and socioeconomic information about the species that we're interested in. So, for example, if we select here the feijoa, Acaceleuiana, click on that link, it will open within the agroforestry species switchboard and then show which databases, external or internal ICRAF databases, have more information, detailed information on on this particular species. And it includes a broad range of databases, ranging from forage databases that have detailed information about the nutritional value for animals of the foliage of trees, right to seed storage characteristics and how to propagate the seeds, and many other aspects are directly available through a single link through that agroforestry species switchboard. So in a way, the switchboard is a meta database. It unites several databases and overcomes the fragmentation of data across databases. So it's a major leap forward in terms of integration of knowledge available on biodiversity, plant biodiversity in this case. So the second point, the second column here is the taxonomy. Of course, when we're talking about tropical trees or threatened species, we often need to take great care to make sure that we actually know which species we're talking about, because of the taxonomic difficulties and taxonomic changes, and also discrepancies between regions, sometimes talking about the same species and sometimes using the same name for different species. So this is disambiguated by the World Flora Online link, where we can find detailed information about what the taxonomic status accepted now is in a consortium of floras and herbariums that are integrated in the World Flora Online. And then finally, we get a direct link to the Q Plants of the World Online database, which gives us more detailed information about herbariums. So the herbarium record of that particular species. So again, a direct link to that species record in the herbarium database, where we can get more into depth about the botanical, the taxonomic, the anatomical details of that species, if we want to actually check that in further detail. And finally, we have a direct link to the Society of Ecological Restoration database on seed storage characteristics. That's quite important, especially for tropical species, especially the more humid tropical species, that involves a lot of species that have recalcitrant seeds, so cannot be dried up. If we dry them, we kill them. So we need to, for those recalcitrant species, we need to make sure that the storage is appropriate and is short and planted out soon. And there's detailed recommendations on that. And also seed mass, which is not just an ecological or physiological or botanical characteristic of theoretical importance, but is of great practical importance because it represents the reserves that the plant has when planted out in its seed. So the bigger the seed, the more reserves it has to grow. And so the management, the planting depends very much on the amount of reserves that the seed has. And again, just a quick reminder of the conservation status classes of the IUCN Red List, that highlights in these colors the different degrees of threat, from critically endangered to vulnerable, that are color-coded. So in this context, I need to stress that much of the uses of plants that have been traditionally used by indigenous peoples and by other local communities are gradually being lost. The knowledge is lost, and the use, the actual practice of the use, is being lost as well. So people depend less and less on that biodiversity for their livelihoods, for their direct use. And migration has actually, sometimes forced migration, sometimes other kinds of migration has actually, of people are displaced and are forced into new environments, and with that, usually, and in many cases, are not so well adapted and don't know as well the new environment, and therefore use a much smaller proportion of the biodiversity available at that time in that place. So in this example in the Pacific coast of Mexico actually shows how in black here we see the number of uses of the 50-odd species of woody plants in a tropical dry forest of Western Mexico. The black bars show the potential uses, the number of uses that these species potentially offer of this list on the right here. So ranging again from the same categories of use that I mentioned earlier in the Global Useful Native Trees database. And the green bars over superimposed on the black bars show what are actually the uses locally realized by the local community in Western Mexico on the Pacific coast. So it shows that there is a very stark underuse of the socioeconomic functions of biodiversity in many places. This is just one example, but we've seen that in the literature also presented and recognized elsewhere. So we need to relearn how to use neglected biodiversity. And then the Global Useful Native Trees tool is a very powerful tool to find those and to find information documented on those. But of course, the best way always is to work to co-create with local communities how to relearn when that knowledge is available. But we see more and more places that this knowledge is being lost as well. So not just the biodiversity is being lost, but also the knowledge about how to use it sustainably. So this is all a set of tools that are already available, made available by CIFOR-ICRAF. And so I encourage you to have a look at them. They're extremely powerful and freely available online. Even on the phone, they are very practical to access and interact. Now, I will get to this second stage of the seminar today, which focuses on what we are planning or what we are starting to do now. So as a second level of decision tool, we're now interested in how to combine those species that are well adapted to our local climate and address our socioeconomic needs. How can we combine them in the same space without one competing with the other? So how to intercrop, how to combine and plant together trees and shrubs and crops and forage species in the same space without one competing with the other, but rather by them using different resources or using resources in different ratios so that they can complement one another. So the idea here is to optimize agroforestry systems in our planning that have a greater occupation of niches, of ecological niches in the agroecosystem. So in a way, we're trying to now increase alpha diversity, increase the diversity at the plot level, in the agricultural field, or even on the horticultural bed. How do we combine the different species that they don't compete on the same horticultural bed? And we're linking this intercropping tool with the Global Useful Native Trees tool that I presented just earlier, so that we can easily draw on the ecophysiological and socioeconomic properties of those species to find them and add them to our intercrop. So we want to avoid repeating the standard recipe of the same species that are recommended and promoted by extension services or the manuals, but rather make it flexible and make local projects, local communities draw on the relevant information so that they can make their own decisions and broaden the diversity actually used. So the challenge here is to intercrop for food, medicine, fiber, timber, fuel in the same space at the same time, but in a dynamic process, starting on degraded land. So we're not proposing to convert forest into agroforestry, but rather to start with degraded land that has low diversity and also low use potential currently, or even high use potential, but can, like in agricultural monocultures, for example, but can receive a greater utilization of resources by a larger diversity of crops and trees and shrubs. So we're looking at a temporal gradient of agroforest succession. But of course, in these images, it looks very diverse and very complex, maybe too complex. So we're also looking at how to support decision-making, that to simplify it to the level that the user requires. So some users can maybe deal with 20, 30 species in the same intercrop, whereas others can only deal with 2 or 3. So we want to build a tool that serves the needs of both these groups. But just make a step backwards and look at the evidence that we have to actually boost productivity and ecosystem functioning based on intercropping. So our own experimental work of our PhD graduate, Diego dos Santos, has actually sampled our successional agroforestry systems in the subtropics of southern Brazil and has fitted structural equation models that show how the crop functional diversity actually drives the light interception efficiency by the ecosystem, and that in turn boosts crop productivity. So the efficiency of light use by a functionally more diverse crop community ensures that at least the light niches are better occupied by the crop community. But at the same time, we find that crop cover is increased by the same crop functional diversity driver. So that means that laterally, there's less space for weed invasion. And indeed, weed cover was very substantially reduced by that same functional diversity. So crop functional diversity is a key driver of multiple agroecosystem functions. And here we're looking at the first crop cycle of successional agroforestry. Like here you see the banana and the pigeon pea and the sweet potatoes in a diverse, relatively diverse intercrop, where the niches are, the ecological niches are effectively occupied. And crop functional diversity also reduced weed functional diversity. So basically crowding out the weeds out of the ecosystem. Now, when we're looking at this over time, over several years, what we frequently find is that after a couple of years, we get a drop in productivity because those herbaceous crops and shrubby crops are harvested and then leave open a gap when the trees are still seedlings or only planted at the later stage, like frequently observed in those successional, more commercial successional agroforestry systems. As already observed decades ago by Roeland Kindt and Jack Ewell in Central America. So current successional agroforestry systems, especially widely now practiced in Brazil and other places, have focused on cutting out this delay of the growth of the woody species, and by intercropping the trees from the very first day of planting the horticultural crops. So by that, we can avoid such delay in ecosystem development and also avoid the sudden substantial increase in weed invasion that we frequently see when the annual crops are removed from the ecosystem. And in principle, we see a similar situation also for the trees. So if we're looking at the modeling done by Daniel Folster in Australia, we find that here the green symbols are pioneer trees that colonize the secondary forest in the first years or so of secondary succession. And here we're looking at the leaf area per ground area, that is a leaf area index. So how efficiently light is being used by the secondary forest. And indeed, the pioneers do a very efficient job in occupying the ecosystem. But then after 10 years or so, sometimes 15, sometimes 20 years, there's a sudden dieback of pioneer species. And that's actually produced in some places the pioneer deserts that then suddenly collapse, and sometimes it reverts back to the degraded ecosystem that was there before, covered by lianas or other kind of low diversity environments that have low quality for biodiversity conservation, but also low levels of use for the local communities. So how can we avoid this collapse and the delay in development of other functional groups of trees after this collapse? How can we advance the establishment of those later successional species underneath the pioneers from the very start? So I will try to address this issue in the next few slides, but let's start with what traits do we need to take into account to ensure that different species of crops, shrubs, and trees complement one another well and efficiently. So to be a really useful tool, what we should do is to integrate more than one niche dimension in a single trait, because otherwise we'll need lots of traits to really capture what's going on in the ecosystem. So we want high level of prediction by few numbers of traits, and we even want the traits to be easily understood so that farmers, restorationists, and so on in the field can take the decisions on how to combine them, how to manage them, how to prune them, and so on directly, independently. And so we're interested in using traits that are already used by agroforest practitioners. And we also need those trait data to be available for hundreds to thousands of species. We don't want to revert back to the manuals of a couple of species and everybody plants the same couple of species. We want a highly flexible tool that can be suited by local communities to their needs and addresses their socioeconomic demands, but at the same time uses their own knowledge and their own preference, cultural preferences. So we need this tool to be highly flexible. So we would propose that the first most promising trait is the productive lifespan of plants. So how long a plant stays in the agroforestry system. So that trait is quite effectively integrating several other ecophysiological traits, because it addresses when a plant needs most nutrients, water, light. So we're not looking at one particular process of light requirement, light absorption, or nutrient absorption. Rather, we're looking at it in an integrated way, looking at the lifespan. How long does the plant need those resources? Because that's at the larger macro level really governing competition and complementarity. And why we're saying productive lifespan? Well, we don't just want to know the maximum potential lifespan that a plant biologically can survive. We rather want to know how long, from an agroforestry perspective, it's convenient to keep it in the agroforestry system. We don't want a stagnating plant that's sick and with low productivity. We rather want those plants to be harvested before it reaches stagnation phase. And another key trait is maximum height. And again, maximum height in a productive sense. So if we harvest a plant or if we manage a plant through pruning that's lower, that ideally produces well in lower stature, then we should incorporate that in our modeling of intercropping. And the third trait, a very key one, is the relative light demand. So different species need different levels of light. That's well established. And the famous examples of low light or shade tolerant species is like coffee, cacao, tea, and so on. But then, in a way, we are mimicking secondary succession, but we're also modifying some aspects of secondary succession. We don't want to copy and paste secondary succession of the natural forest. Because if we look at the natural forest structure, we find that there is a quick overcrowding of the upper strata by plants, both in temperate forests and in tropical forests. So this tendency of overcrowding in the upper strata leaves the lower strata unproductive. In natural forests, regeneration and mature forests, we tend to find at latter stages low density of trees and shrubs and even herbs. Like taking the example of beech forests here in Central Europe, like we see in a mature beech forest, very little undergrowth. But a similar process, but of course with much higher diversity also in tropical forests. Like the highly shaded forests are quite easy to walk through because there's not much undergrowth in our way. But that means that we get a lot of competition in the upper layers and we don't produce much in the lower layers. So in the efficient agroforestry system, we can actually invert that structure by having a lower density of emergent, highly light demanding species, and then have a gradually higher proportion of occupancy of each strata as we go lower down towards the understory. So if we structure agroforestry systems in this density structure, we can harness much more efficiently the light that's available. But of course, that requires a lot of pruning. And pruning is a lot of work, and sometimes risky, especially high-level pruning, or selective cutting of trees. And not just risky for the operators, for the farmers and silviculturists who manage it, but also for the rest of the systems to throw over the logs and to pull the logs out is potentially quite destructive. So we really need to organize these different management operations in space and time so that one component doesn't jeopardize the other. So we can maybe simplify this approach to diversified, very productive use of successional agroforestry in 3 key principles. High density. So we need, we want to occupy the space efficiently. So for that, we need high planting density, but not high planting density of a monoculture. We need diversity to be able to occupy the different niches, as we saw before. So high density and high diversity are interdependent. They only work if they work together. And then we also need high intensity and frequency of pruning and selective harvesting. So if we combine those 3 principles, we can really design very efficient, very productive, and biodiverse agricultural and forestry systems. If we drop one of those principles, our performance will drop considerably. Now, one of the big challenges is to access data on some of those traits. Especially, we're interested in the shade tolerance, or conversely defined as relative light demand. So the inverse of shade tolerance would be relative light demand. How do we know this for other species that are less widely known, not as widely known as coffee, cacao, and so on? And not just to define that in an ecological sense, but to also communicate that across different cultural groups, from scientists to extensionists and farmers and restorationists. There are all these different stakeholder groups who are interested in biodiverse agriculture and restoration, can actually understand each other and share their knowledge and actually apply this on a more massive scale. So we can, first of all, define the relative light demand from an ecophysiological perspective as the whole plant light compensation point, a plant trait that's been relatively recently defined and is not that widely known, but it's basically the photon flux that reaches a plant below which the plant stops growing. So if we reduce the light conditions gradually, even further, at some point the plant will stop growing. The light level at which that plant stops growing is the whole plant light compensation point, which is a measure of the relative light demand. But of course, to communicate that is very complex, not very accessible. So we can redefine this in a maybe more intuitive way, which is the leaf area above a plant that a plant can tolerate before it stops growing. So it's the same principle, but not in terms of photon flux, but in terms of shading. So it's the inverse. Like, that's why the arrows are going in opposite directions. The relative light demand is the inverse of shade tolerance. But again, it's still quite tricky to engage a broad audience. So practitioners have used basically the same gradient of shade tolerance or relative light demand by classifying the relative light demand into strata. What we've seen very much in plant or in forest ecology is defined by agroforest practitioners in a similar way, but slightly different. So we classify into, for example, low, medium, high, and emergent strata, which is an increasing, represents an increasing level of relative light demand of the species. And then we can see the spread of species across that gradient. So probably they are more overcrowded at the top. So more species are more light demanding than shade tolerant. Probably. Well, let's have a look at initial data. So here we have compiled practitioners' knowledge of relative light demand that are used currently by, in this case, Brazilian agroforest practitioners. Key contributors are on the right-hand side. Thanks very much to their work on compiling and practicing that. And so here we're looking at those horizontal lines represent the start of harvesting along a temporal scale since planting, and the ideal removal time before the plant starts stagnating. And that for a range of plants across a spectrum of life forms, ranging from herbs, climbers, shrubs, trees, and palms. So we're looking at the relative light demand against the lifespan. Two of the key traits, the integrative traits that we were talking about earlier. Now, classifying those into these strata and looking at some examples, like maize would be harvested like 3 or 4 months from planting, depending on whether we want the green cob or the dry grain. And so it goes. We can then click on the tool on any particular species, on a particular line, and then see which species we're looking at there. And so we want really to spread our intercropping selection evenly out across this graph. We don't want to select several species within the same quadrant. So, and we can adjust the complexity of our agroforestry system by ensuring that they are not overlapping. They're not in the same quadrant. But if we want a simpler kind of agroforestry system, I'll get to the simpler one in a second. So first of all, a broader view of it. So here on the left-hand side, of course, we are looking at a highly dominant, group of species that are highly dominated by herbaceous crops. And then as we go along, we see more the green ones that are shrubs, and then the trees in purple, and so on. Now, we're seeing probably too many species here for our agroforestry system. So we really want to reduce down the number of species to the ones that are not competing with one another. So the closer they are, or the more species there are in the same quadrant, the more likely there is competition going. But if we pick them really well and make sure that each quadrant has only one species, we can still possibly manage to mediate competition. But if that's too complex and there's a lot of unknowns in there, and the planning is not as precise, so if we want to be on the safe side, we can just pick species that are more distant in this bivariate trait space. So when we reduce it further, we can also pick and differentiate varieties, like cultivars, of the same species. Like, for example, banana has cultivars that are slightly variable in their relative light demand and in their maximum production cycle. And so that's we are treating different cultivars as different functional species, let's say, in this intercropping tool. And then in different levels of color selection, we can highlight just the native species based on the location selected in the global useful native trees selection phase earlier. We can prioritize the threatened species. We can pick particularly deciduous species if we want the overstory to be light transmissive in the dry or cold season. And we can pick particularly nitrogen fixing species if we need to enrich our system with nitrogen. So again, if we then click on the species name, we should be able to open the agroforestry species switchboard of CIFOR-ICRAF that has, again, this plethora of databases available, linking directly to the records of technical and botanical and socioeconomic and cultural data of that species that we've selected. And at this stage, we also want to link to other tools, including other intercropping tools that are already available, like the polyculture design tool that is focused very much on herbaceous plants, on agricultural plants, and has not many trees in there yet, but has very more advanced functionalities for horticultural and other annual and biennial plants. So our idea is our tool serves as a starting point to find other tools that are either regionally more relevant or in terms of the topic, the challenge involved for a particular project. And then the next stage is to recognize what's the natural structure of our local ecosystem. And we can, at this stage, pull that out of the ecoregions database, which has a global map of ecoregions. And then we can click on our particular, for example, here the Atlantic forest, mountain coastal forests, and then click on that to see what the structure of this local ecosystem is like. If in our particular location, we only have fine degraded land, as we increasingly find, then we want to know how the potential vegetation looks like in terms of structure at that location, to know both what we want to restore or how we want to adapt that potential vegetation structure to our agroforestry system. So to how we want to design our agroforestry system that comes close to or imitates part of the natural vegetation structure to avoid hydrological overuse of water pulling out of the soil and so on. So this would be an image of the structure. It's quite far, but there's different images available on the ecoregions portal that can show us the natural vegetation structure. So, but of course, this global intercropping tool is very rough. It's like a first approximation. So it doesn't take into account, for example, the rooting system of trees or plants. It doesn't take into account lots of other traits that are potentially important for interspecies interactions, like, for example, multi-trophic interactions. So the allelopathy or the interactions with herbivores and then with predators that interact with the herbivores, none of this is being taken into account in our initial intercropping tool. So we really designed this tool as a first step, as a tool to reduce the workload in planning and researching, and come to a list of species that are well adapted to the local conditions and socioeconomic demands, and also combine well together ecophysiologically at the first rough level. And then the second step, of course, would be to co-create with our local farmers, using their knowledge and their priorities, having them guide the process, and us entering as support to develop those highly diverse and efficient agroforestry systems that restore and use the biodiversity at the same time. Now, one of the key traits that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think we should make an effort to include, is the resprouting capacity of plants. So after pruning, how well do they resprout? That's also a trait that varies a lot among species and is really crucial in planning. So if a plant doesn't resprout well, it will occupy larger and larger space in the agroforestry system, and we can't prune it a lot to make space and light for others. So we need to take that into account in planning. So basically our proposal here is to start with the sort of data visualization that we already have to encourage practitioners and collaborators to contribute their own data. So when they use our tool, they see, oh, I want my species to be in there, to use it in my planning, to offer my consultancies to for other farmers or agencies who want me to include my or offer my planning for agroforestry systems or restoration. So they want to add their data and then use that a new version of the tool with their data and species in there. And then we have a team of database curators who check the authenticity of the contribution to avoid pollution of bots and all these other kinds of factors that easily can pollute databases which are open to citizen science contributions. And then we load these updates into a new version of the database, which then becomes available in the new version to be visualized in our online interactive tool. And we're starting this whole thing with an initial database that I've already shown you some snapshots of. So this is actually integrated in a larger framework of CIFOR-ICRAF work that, as Lars mentioned at the start, involves a whole set of stakeholder and planning and implementation activities that start from identifying priority areas for tree planting, then checking the species distributions, as the Global Useful Native Tree Species tool already does, and then considering planters' needs, and that's where our intercropping tool comes in. So to support not just to know which species to plant where, but also how to combine them in the same space and get to higher multifunctionality through higher alpha diversity in agroforestry. And then the whole set of key demands in work on germplasm and nurseries and seed collection and nursery production and so on, that are a big challenge, and CIFOR-ICRAF is also working on those. So this is involved in a larger framework of climate appropriate portfolios of tree diversity, CAP-TD. And I encourage you to have a look at this concept, which integrates different areas of work in a very effective way. Now, but these intercropping tools and other kind of interactive online tools are sometimes a challenge to engage certain groups of people. So we're also working on communicating about traits and about spatial arrangements and temporal dynamics of diversified successional agroforestry systems in different ways. So for example, here our former student, Jefferson Mocker, who is one of those students who taught us much more than we taught him, created this amazing game tool of, he calls it Agroflorestinha, like little agroforest, which simulates how different crops and trees occupy different niches in space and time. So we can simulate within row and between row spacings. We can simulate growth and pruning. So we can take back the canopy with magnets that are detachable and then grow again. And then different species and functional groups occupy different spaces. We add also woody mulch in particular spaces that avoid the excessive immobilization of nutrients and address the nutritional needs of plants, and simulate the vertical stratification, crucially. So it's basically a game to optimize where, when, and how in successional agroforestry. So there's different ways to implement that. So Jefferson, in particular, used real sticks from plants and leaves or clay sculptures, depending on the species, or sometimes paper elements with magnets that connect them here. But people can also use like drawings in the sand to symbolize spacings and their spatial arrangements with letters or with symbols or with little branches pruned from trees or shrubs to symbolize different species. That's a very powerful, engaging way to take this initial planning to a next step, which is engaging with the local communities to how to actually implement, how to mediate different demands, how to create synergies, not just from a theoretical planning perspective, but also to mediate different demands within the community or within the family, the farming family, and so on, to really get to a multifunctional agroforestry. And then I will jump over the labor-saving aspects, because we are kind of running out of time. And we also have the opportunity in a second seminar that I will give here at the university to get more into how to save labor, because obviously this kind of diversified system requires a lot more labor. It's much more productive, potentially, if we get it right. It has much higher performance in terms of restoration of ecological functions, but it's more labor intensive. So how can we save labor is the topic of the next seminar that will be widely advertised. So organizing well the diversity in space, not randomly, but in an efficient, planned way, is what we'll address there. And also how to enable mechanization in a socioeconomic way that smallholders that don't have a lot of capital, financial capital, can still access mechanization through shared arrangements. So, for example, cooperatives or farmers associations share machines by renting them out or lending them out to smallholders on the days that they require them. Or other arrangements that have been becoming more and more successful is for farmers to get organized and pressure local governments to enable public lending or renting machines through the municipal government, for example, to smallholder farmers. And we've learned lots from the Brazilian landless movement that has done major strides, a leap forward in terms of farmer organization to get mechanization compatible with high diversity agroforestry. At this stage, I will thank you very much, and I hope we'll have the opportunity for some exchange here. And I will also thank very much the different institutions and people who have contributed. Obviously, it's a very collective process to build this experience and to illustrate it. So I very much thank all the parties involved that have contributed. Thank you very much. In terms of chats, I can only see Roeland and
yes, hi Ilyas.
Hi.
Hi everyone. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
So maybe that we can see one another. I think what I had put note. Thank you very much, Ilyas, for the excellent presentation again. So I think mine was more a comment here that a lot of the work that then led to the development of the GlobUNT and what to plant where, portals, etc. That's actually the result from a long, decades-long collaboration between the group of the University of Copenhagen, now that used to be the Forest and Landscape, and even earlier, the Danida Forest Seed Centre. So I just want to thank again all those people involved and many people that I can see online, that I've worked with before. So that it's really the benefit of collaborating, and it's now also very nice to have your group join as well. I don't want to take too much time otherwise, but depending on other questions, now I quickly wanted to highlight that some of the work of the GlobUNT also resulted from work on what's called the Global Biodiversity Standard, which is linked in the publications. And the other comment I wanted to make is actually that your work, Ilyas, also builds on a long tradition already in the tropics and in Brazil, of syntropic agriculture, and also that already the tool that you are designing, that it already directly links to questions that extension workers have been asking. Already they know about these multi-strata systems, but they want to combine the knowledge. It's like different people have different answers, not different pieces of the puzzle, but also your tool. No, it's not a novel concept, but it's building also on the tradition in Brazil of already managing these very complex systems. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but if time, maybe you can also talk a bit about these ideas of syntropic agriculture. But thank you very much. I enjoyed very much. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Roeland. Yes, absolutely. So much of the design decisions were very much based on what practitioners actually use. And, we've taken into account especially the Brazilian practitioner audience because of our contact there. But now it's also the similar principles are widely used elsewhere.